Hello everyone, I'm Brian Stauffer, Spanish translator at the GLO. Today I'm pleased to host This Week in Texas History, a weekly show that is part of the Save Texas History program. Save Texas History is brought to you by Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office. If you love our state's history and want to make sure that it lasts forever, please visit www.savetexashistory.org, and we encourage you to make a tax-deductible donation. Today we are honored to have with us Art Martinez De Vara. Art is a historian, author, and attorney. He holds a Master of Arts in History from Sam Houston State University and a doctorate in law from St. Mary's University. He is also an adjunct faculty member at Our Lady of the Lake University and served as mayor of Von Ormy, Texas from 2008 to 2015. He is the author of several books and the winner of the 2016 Texas State Genealogical Association Society Grand Prize Book Award and the 2014 Presidio La Bahia Award. His brand new book is Tejano Patriot, The Revolutionary Life of Jose Francisco Ruiz, 1783 to 1840, which was published by the Texas State Historical Association in 2020. Art has made a presentation on his book that we're going to screen, and then we're going to reconvene in a live setting to do a quick Q&A session.
I'm Art Martinez De Vara, author of Tejano Patriot, The Revolutionary Life of Jose Francisco Ruiz. Jose Francisco Ruiz is most popularly known for having signed the Texas Declaration of Independence in 1836, but his experience with revolution began much earlier in 1810. As Napoleon swept through the Iberian Peninsula and forced the King of Spain to abdicate, he placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Spain. This caused a political and philosophical crisis in the Spanish Empire that ultimately drew in provincials like Jose Francisco Ruiz and others in this grand debate of who should govern, what were the rights of the people, and what type of government they wanted. In 1810, Francisco Ruiz was serving as city attorney on the city council here in San Antonio when revolution first rose up in central Mexico. Father Hidalgo gave his famous Grito de Dolores, and the revolution kicked off in an attempt to restore the rights of the King of Spain against this perceived French imposter. Ruiz initially began as a royalist in that debate. As the northern provinces of New Spain rose up, Texas remained relatively quiet. The result being that rumors began to spread throughout the town that the Presidio companies were going to be relocated to the Rio Grande to put down the uprising. This caused great distress among the locals, in particular who were afraid of Comanche and Apache attack. The result was the De las Casas revolt. De las Casas was a retired military officer who led an uprising and proclaimed his uprising in favor of Hidalgo's revolution. Ruiz, under the influence of his in-laws, formed the core of the royalist opposition. Initially, they remained quiet, But as De las Casas proved to be a tyrant and basically displeasing to everybody, a counter-revolution was organized, and Francisco Ruiz and several others participated. They overthrew De las Casas and restored royal order in San Antonio. This led to Ruiz's first military commission. The royalists decided to reward those who had participated in the counter-revolution. Ruiz was appointed quartermaster of the presidial companies, a role that he would repeat throughout his career. When the French forced the Spanish king to abdicate, it triggered an intense debate in Spanish America over the nature of government. Spanish theorists had for centuries developed philosophies of the right of governance. In particular, among the neo-scholastics in the Salamanca school, was the idea that the monarchy was not a divine institution. This was based on their belief that the Catholic Church was the only divine institution in the world, and thus they developed a theory that kings were governed by the consent of the governed, that the basic unit of society was the municipal corporation, and this is reflected. We see this structure reflected even in the informal title of the King of Spain. He was called Rey de las Españas y de las Indias, King of the Spains and the Indies, in a plural sense. So each province was viewed as autonomous of one another, with a common monarch governing that each province by its consent. So when Napoleon forced the King of Spain to abdicate, the various provinces were faced for the first time with real-world action based upon their philosophical understanding of governance. Texas was no different. Should they align themselves with this French-imposed king, or should they continue their alliance with the king who had abdicated, or should they form independent republics, as was the model from the United States and Haiti in the New World? The debate raged on even here in Texas, with Hidalgo's revolution reaching San Antonio around 1810. Ruiz continued to serve as a royalist military officer until 1813. With the arrival of the Gutierrez-McGee expedition, Ruiz would undergo a political transformation that would lead him to be one of the most radical liberals of his era. Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara was an emissary sent by Father Hidalgo to the United States in an attempt to get the United States support to join his uprising. Before Gutierrez was able to accomplish his goal, Hidalgo was captured and executed. But Gutierrez persisted. He ended up meeting with the President of the United States, presenting the cause for Mexican independence. He was unfortunately declined. The United States declined to get actively involved because of a pending war with Great Britain, the War of 1812. But Gutierrez was given permission to raise an army in Louisiana and to use it as a base of operations, which he did. In preparing for his invasion of Texas, Gutierrez began to smuggle in a series of polemics or political treaties explaining the cause for independence and the need to form a Mexican republic. Jose Francisco Ruiz, the quartermaster in San Antonio, was in a perfect position to receive these smuggled goods, as he himself participated in smuggling as a way of provisioning the military. This began an illicit correspondence between the two men, which is referenced in Ruiz's retirement records. And slowly, through this illicit correspondence with Gutierrez, Ruiz underwent a political conversion. He chose to remain in the Royalist Army as a spy and assisted the revolutionaries as they proceeded through Texas. Ruiz was injured at the siege of La Bahia, but through remaining correspondence, we know he provided intelligence and planning with Gutierrez for the capture of San Antonio, which happened bloodlessly. After San Antonio was captured by the rebels, Ruiz switched his allegiances and took the oath of independence in Military Plaza in front of his house. This was the first declaration of independence in Latin America. It occurred here in San Antonio in 1813. Ruiz then continued his military career as second in command of the Tejano forces as they awaited for the Spanish to return. There was much intrigue and controversy in the army as the various players possessed different objectives. Many of the Americans were on a filibustering expedition in an attempt to bring Texas into the United States, while most of the Tejanos were seeking independence, an independent Mexico, with Texas as an integral part of it. This led to a lot of tensions among the Army, particularly over the leadership. In fact, the Army was Ruiz and Menchaca, his superior, were planning a court-martial at the moment that the Spanish appeared on the horizon. So the Revolutionary Army took the field of battle divided. This was ultimately the Battle of Medina, the largest battle to occur in the state of Texas. It ended up being a rout. Menchaca was killed in the battle, which left Ruiz as the highest-ranking Tejano military officer. He led 2 direct charges into the Spanish lines, which were unsuccessful, and he led the men off the field of battle, and they retreated to La Bahia. At this point, Ruiz led the remaining survivors from the Battle of Medina that were with him to the neutral strip in what is present-day Louisiana. The neutral strip was an area of dispute between Spain and the United States, and so by treaty, both countries had agreed to not have a presence. So it was a no man's land with no government, full of pirates and bandits and stateless people like Francisco Ruiz. We know from Spanish spy reports and a sumaria, or a legal case against Francisco Ruiz, the Spanish intelligence of the time, they indicate him forming a rebel camp there with what's called Santa Barbara Rio Hondo Ranch. Ultimately, he became an arms dealer with the Comanche, getting his provisions in New Orleans that were shipped up to Natchitoches, and he spent the next 8 years living among the Comanche as an arms dealer, as a spy, and leading them on various expeditions against the Spanish and other indigenous opponents. So after 8 years of living among the Comanche and assisting them in their raiding of the province, Texas was decimated. In fact, the governor at one point recommended that the province simply be abandoned. As independence from Mexico seemed inevitable, the powers that be on the royalist side switched sides, and Francisco Ruiz was offered a pardon in exchange for him serving as a peace negotiator with the Comanche and the Lipan Apache, which he agreed to. So in 1821, he was pardoned by the same Joaquin de Arredondo he had fought at the Battle of Medina, and he made preparations for this expedition throughout Indian country. He was ultimately successful negotiating a treaty both with the Lipan Apache and the Comanche. The treaty was rather remarkable for its age. It granted Mexican citizenship to the Comanche. It had provisions such as an exchange of boys. 10 boys, Comanche boys, would be sent to Mexico City each year to be educated and to learn the culture and the legal system of Mexico. Both parties agreed to only pass through each other's territory using passports, and trade was fixed at San Antonio. Ruiz then led he held a convention of Comanche warriors, the largest ever recorded, 3,000 on the Great Plains in North Texas. It was a 3-day convention where people were allowed to speak at length, and ultimately the Comanches agreed and nominated six of their warriors to travel to Mexico City to sign a treaty with the then Emperor of Mexico, Augustine I. Ruiz led that expedition and served as translator. He went to the Imperial Court in Mexico City, where the treaty was signed, and returned to San Antonio after all those years of exile, a hero, and one who was able to secure, at least temporarily, peace among the warring tribes on the frontier. Unfortunately, his treaty wasn't long to last. When Mexico became a republic 2 years later, the new Congress disavowed all treaties that were signed by the imperial government, and funds were never sent to provide for the Comanche as had been agreed under the terms of the agreement, and it quickly fell apart. This early period of Mexican independence was one of a great debate among Mexicans as to what would the nature of their country be, and a lot of this has roots in the political understanding of the Mexican Empire. Of the Spanish Empire. Constitution provided for a strong provincial governments, and Ruiz and other liberals like De Vara were strong supporters of that original constitution. Following his successful Indian treaty service, Ruiz was a military officer without an assignment, and he spent the next year and a half requesting a military assignment. The challenge was, since he had spent 8 years as a rebel fighting a proxy war against the Spanish, those were the same military officers who now served in the Mexican army in Texas, and there was a great distrust between those military officers and Francisco Ruiz. This was ultimately resolved in the Fredonian Revolt. Ruiz was ultimately given command over a militia company in San Antonio, and during the Fredonian Revolt, Ruiz used his Indian allies and his connections to negotiate their neutrality. Though they had initially sided with the Fredonians, this proved to be ultimately one of the main reasons why the revolt was able to be successfully suppressed, and Ruiz kind of underwent a restoration process where he was welcomed once again in the Mexican army. These early years were formative for Texas. Stephen F. Austin had started his colony, and Francisco Ruiz developed a close friendship with Austin, and the two of them were active on the political scene in trying to shape the future of Texas. Economics was another deep concern for Ruiz and other Federalists. Texas had repeatedly been denied access or the creation of a port at Galveston or Port Aransas by both the Spanish and the Mexican authorities. They viewed the possibility of a port as key to Texas's future economic growth. In 1826, Mexico sent a boundary commission to Texas to survey the new border with the United States along the Sabine River. Ruiz was asked to join the expedition as an advisor. Ruiz wrote a report on the Indian tribes of Texas, which is notable for its insights into particularly Comanche culture. Ruiz had lived among the Comanche for 8 years and wrote a level of detail including their eschatology, their various warrior fraternities, their systems of morality, whereas his contemporaries at the time typically viewed them as simply as Indios Barbaros, or barbarian Indians, and discounted them culturally as a barbarian group without reason. After the Boundary Commission, Ruiz received a new assignment as commander of the Alamo Company. One of the results of this commission was a report. The report was alarming, called Mieri Terán, the general who wrote the report, indicated that there was a large volume of illegal immigrants who had settled in East Texas, who were outside of the Mexican authority, didn't speak English, weren't Catholics, and the report called for a re-Mexicanization of Texas, which the Mexican Congress approved. One of the implementations of this plan was to create 5 new settlements and presidios among the Anglo population. Francisco Ruiz was sent to form a settlement which was named Fort Tenochtitlan. Each of the settlements were given names that were associated with central Mexico, and Tenochtitlan being the Aztec capital there in Mexico City. It was envisioned as a new capital for the state of Texas. It's roughly 20 miles north of present-day College Station, in what was then Austin's colony. Ruiz went out with his company into the wilderness. He had to cut the road leading to the settlement, which was on the Brazos River. He founded the settlement, and it was a very tenuous and difficult task. Ruiz ultimately fell ill with an unknown disease that he caught in the wilderness, and his company was continuously plagued with soldiers going AWOL, with illness, with lack of supplies, and ultimately the project failed. Ruiz, as his health began to fail, began a prolific correspondence with Stephen F. Austin, with his military commanders over the situation, and ultimately he abandoned the project on his own and rode back to San Antonio, where he applied for retirement. In one of his letters, he describes even wanting to abandon San Antonio. He was done with politics. He was done with the military. He simply wanted to go out onto the Medina River on his ranch and retire. Unfortunately, history would not allow him to do so. Within a few years, we ultimately lead to the events that would lead up to Texas independence. In Mexico, this big debate over what would constitute the Mexican nation continued to persist. A ultra-liberal Congress was elected with Santa Anna, President Santa Anna elected president. Santa Anna himself was a liberal, but was of the view of gradual reform, whereas the Congress wanted immediate and radical reform. Among the reforms that the Congress passed was the elimination of fueros, which are special privileges for both the Catholic Church and the Army. These were perceived by those institutions as extremely hostile. They were perceived by the general population as being overly radical, and President Santa Anna was put in a political situation where he was attempting to slow down the rate of reform in an attempt to maintain political stability. Ultimately, that proved impossible, and President Santa Anna dismissed the Congress, called for new elections with the prior congressman ineligible, and suspended the Constitution. This was viewed with great alarm in Texas by both the Tejano Federalists and the Anglo settlers, and the very first rumblings of Texas independence began with various committees of safety being formed, various conventions, and being called for discussion, including one in which Francisco Ruiz was a leader here in San Antonio. Unfortunately, the records of that convention no longer exist. As the events of Texas independence unfolded, Francisco Ruiz continued to reside on his ranch just south of San Antonio. As the Texian army approaches San Antonio, it was under the command of Stephen F. Austin, again Ruiz's longtime friend, and he immediately begins sending provisions to the army, which from his ranch and others. Juan Seguin forms a military company and rides along the various Tejano ranches for recruits and for provisions, which includes the Ruiz Ranch on the Medina River in present-day Vaughn Army, Texas. The Texian forces take the Alamo from the Mexican Army, what's known as the Siege of Bear, and we see for the first time Francisco Ruiz being called out of retirement in the cause for Texas independence. So following the capture of the Alamo, the majority of the men left on what's often been described as a wild expedition called the Matamoros expedition, in an attempt to take the city of Matamoros. This left the Alamo scantily secured with just a handful of soldiers. Seguin's company was among them. Francisco Ruiz agreed to lead a provisioning expedition which he did. He enlisted about 24 carteros, or ox cartsmen. They went down to present-day Port Lavaca and spent several weeks unloading provisions that had been sent from Louisiana for the Texian army, and ultimately came back to the Alamo with provisions for the army, which were the provisions that allowed them to hold out during the siege of the Alamo. Prior to the arrival of the Mexican army in Texas, elections were held for a convention at Washington on the Brazos. Francisco Ruiz was elected as one of the delegates to represent the city of San Antonio, and along with his nephew, Jose Antonio Navarro. The two of them and 3 escorts, which included Ruiz's son-in-law, Blas Herrera, left San Antonio prior to the arrival of the Mexican army and attended the convention at Washington on the Brazos. We know quite a bit about Ruiz's activity at the convention because of a boarder named William Gray, who boarded with Navarro, Ruiz, and Zavala. They rented the floor of a carpenter's shop, and Gray left a detailed diary of the day-to-day activities. Ruiz was the second to sign the Declaration of Independence on the original document, and which occurred the day after they received news of the fall of the Alamo. A no longer surviving letter from Seguin arrived. It was the first to arrive at the convention. It was written in Spanish, and it was informing Ruiz and Navarro of the events at the Alamo. The convention then stayed up late into the night. As Ruiz, Navarro, and others retreated along with the Texan government, they stopped next at Grosh's plantation, where they met with Joe, the slave of William Travis, and again learned more about the Battle of the Alamo and its after effects. It was there that Ruiz learned that his son, Francisco Antonio Ruiz, had been appointed alcalde by Santa Ana. He had oversaw the burial of both the Texans and the Mexicans following the battle, and was serving in that capacity. As the Texian government continued to retreat along with civilians in a process known as a runaway scrape, Ruiz ultimately ended up in Nacogdoches, which is where he learned the victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, and from there he went into Louisiana, to Natchitoches and elsewhere, to settle affairs, sell some land, and prepare for his return. Ruiz arrived back in San Antonio in the summer of 1836, a few weeks prior to the initial elections in the Republic of Texas. Ruiz threw his hat in the ring, ran for Texas Senate, representing San Antonio, which he prevailed in, and proceeded that fall to convene at Columbia, the first Congress of the Republic of Texas. Ruiz was appointed to serve on the Committee for Indian Affairs, as was suited for because of his background with indigenous negotiations. He was a strong supporter of Sam Houston. He issued a bill calling on the Texas Rangers and the Army of the Republic to stop harassing Mexican citizens or Tejano citizens of the Republic of Texas. The bill was unsuccessful, but it is a pioneering work of Mexican-American civil rights from the very first Congress of the Republic of Texas, arguing for the inclusion of Mexican Texans alongside Anglo-Texans. In the winter of 1836, Stephen F. Austin became very ill, and he passed away during the interim between the two congressional sessions. The day Austin died, Ruiz wrote a letter home to his son-in-law, Blas Herrera, a letter known as the Letter from Columbia. Unlike most of Ruiz's letters, which are very formal in writing, this one is very sentimental. He's obviously missing his longtime friend. He warns the folks in San Antonio of the imminent return of the Mexican army, and he pleads for them to maintain faith with the Republic of Texas. He argues that they have sided with the Americans because they are freedom-loving people and they have the arms to defend it. Clearly, Ruiz is speaking in very practical terms, based upon his long experience as a rebel in frontier security issues in Texas. And so it was as significant to him that the Americans had arms to defend their liberty as much as liberty itself. Ultimately, Ruiz's illness that he caught while trying to establish Fort Tenochtitlan catches up with him, and he falls gravely ill the week prior to the opening of the second congressional session. He never actually attends any of the meetings of the second session, and ultimately he resigns from the Senate, and his son-in-law Blasareta is called from his military assignment to escort him back home to San Antonio. Back in San Antonio, Ruiz semi-retires to his ranch on the Medina River, but he continues to serve in various minor capacities, election judge. Though he doesn't run for office, he's often gathers votes in various elections, and he passes away in January of 1840. With the publication of Tejano Patriot, Jose Francisco Ruiz takes upon a new significance in the historiography of Texas. Through his life and his activities, we can trace the distinct Tejano political and philosophical origins of their national identity. We see the development of Ruiz from a royalist to a staunch liberal, to his role as a federalist within the early debate among Mexican nationality, and ultimately his decision to side with the Americans in the formation of the Republic of Texas. I hope you've enjoyed this short introduction, and I hope you enjoyed Tejano Patriot.
And we're back talking to Art Martinez De Vara, who is the author of the brand new book, Tejano Patriot, The Revolutionary Life of Jose Francisco Ruiz. Art, could you tell us, how did you become interested in Jose Francisco Ruiz? And what surprised you the most in the course of your research?
Well, actually, I kind of had a lifelong interest in Jose, because my mother's family is from a little town called Vaughn Army, Texas, which was established by Ruiz's. I heard stories about the Ruiz family, about Jose Francisco, that I couldn't find anywhere else. You know, they weren't in my 7th grade Texas history book. They weren't, you know, when I was an undergrad doing history, I found very little on him. He was most famous, obviously, for signing the Texas Declaration of Independence. And so I had intended to write about that. My thesis committee kind of encouraged me to expand it into a full biography once I had, you know, realized how much information there really was. It was my master's thesis, and then even after that, I continued on, and about 5 years after, then, you know, finished the manuscript of the book.
Yeah, so you mentioned that that there really wasn't a lot of information out there, at least for, you know, in the sort of public sphere about Jose Francisco Ruiz. But you showed that he was really clearly a kind of key figure in the history of pre-revolutionary Texas. And yours is only one of 2 comprehensive studies of his life and career. Why do you think he's been so ignored for so long?
I think there's several reasons. I think one, he's difficult to place in the traditional narrative or traditional historiography of Texas. You know, especially, you know, in the 19th century, as people really started writing the kind of foundational books on Texas history, there's this narrative pitting, you know, American immigrants versus Mexicans, and having a Mexican on the side of the Texian cause was awkward. And so he was always this kind of superficial figure, literary figure, kind of appearing full-formed as a, you know, Mexican federalist who sided with his Anglo neighbors. He signs the Declaration of Independence and kind of exited screen, and the narrative continued. Also, I think, you know, it's harder to write about Ruiz than, say, Sam Houston or other figures. The records are all in Spanish. The records are scattered throughout multiple archives that have yet to be collected. So if you're going to write on Lamar or Houston, you can go to the Lamar papers, the Houston paper. You know, they've all been collected already, and there's a central repository for, you know, most of their works. Someone like Ruiz, that hasn't happened, and they're written kind of in this formal early 19th century Spanish with difficult abbreviations, Latin phrases, and formalism, formal terminology and lingo. So it's a more difficult to approach. I think when a lot of people are picking dissertation topics and things, it's hard. It's a harder topic to pick. But there is so much out there. I mean, there is as much on figures like Ruiz as there are on other figures that are very well known in Texas history. But there's that barrier, and you do have to cross international borders. Some of these are in Monclova and Mexico City and other archives that aren't as readily accessible.
And I'm glad you brought that up. Could you talk about what archival collections were the most important to you in your research, and what other sort of methodological or theoretical obstacles that you faced in writing the book? I know you said some of these records are in Mexico, for example, and they were written in this difficult Spanish, which I know a lot about as a Spanish translator. It is difficult. Right. But what other kinds of challenges did you face?
Sure. The most logical, and the place I went to first were the Bear archives, which are physically, I got UT Austin, but they're all microfilmed throughout the state. There was quite a bit in the Nacogdoches archives. There are records in Monclova. Again, he was a military officer, so you kind of have to go where those military records ended up in Monclova. There's some in the Archivo Nacional Mexicana, the Mexican National Archives, which are, I guess, based in Mexico City. There are some microfilm copies of it here in various universities in Texas. And then some areas you just have to guess. I mean, he lived as an exile, as a stateless person for 8 years. So gosh, how are you going to find records of that? I went to Natchitoches, Louisiana, knowing that that's the closest location to where he was stationed in exile, and just randomly went to the courthouse to look for anything possible. And we uncovered some warehousing records where we found, records of where he was housing his goods, the arms and the trade goods he was trading with the Comanche illicitly at the time. That was an amazing find. So sometimes you got to think outside of the box and physically go where these people were, where your topic was, and go in and talk to those archivists and those librarians, and they know their records very well. And you start throwing names around and activities he was involved with, and they're like, well, what about this? And you find some great things. In the state archives in Austin, I was able to locate a correspondence that I never thought I would, and it was misfiled. So in Ruiz's his retirement pension application, so he's retiring from the Mexican Army, and so in there he gives his time in the Spanish Army, and he kind of patriotically asks that time not be credited to him for retirement. And in describing his service, he says that he began an illicit correspondence with Bernardo Gutierrez Zelada, and then he joined the First Patriots, is the way he describes it, in Mexico. And that tells me, gosh, there's this illicit correspondence between Ruiz and the Royalist militia, and he says he discusses matters of revolution with Gutierrez Zelada. And so what was amazing, we found one of those letters in the state archives. And sure enough, he even in the letter, he says, I'm writing, quickly at night, and they're discussing how to get the Revolutionary Army to take over San Antonio, but to do it bloodlessly. I'm sure there's more out there. I found things on commercial auction sites like Heritage Auction. They do a lot of autograph signature auctions, and Ruiz is on one of those lists because he's a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. So I found an old auction, and it was personal letters, and so that was very insightful. So here he is having an official military assignment at Fort Tenochtitlan, and these are personal letters where he's writing back home to San Antonio saying, hey, those bear hides that you ordered are delayed. The Indians that I paid to go and get them haven't come in yet, and I'll get them to you. So he's doing commercial activity. So we have official correspondence that if all we followed was the official correspondence, we wouldn't know that he's also doing these personal commercial activities on the side. Those ended up being auctioned off at Heritage as an autograph collection. One of the advantages of researching somebody who's, as you said, kind of for the first time, someone's really digging under the surface, is you get to make some of these initial discoveries. And I'm sure there'll be others. Even since the book's been published, I've had 3 or 4 sources brought to me that were in private collections. Oh, we have this letter, we have that. And so maybe someday we'll do a second edition with more footnotes or whatnot as we collect more things on him as word gets out.
It sounds like you made some really interesting discoveries in the archives, and that's great to to hear. Like there's still things to be discovered in archives, even archives that have been poured over by generations of historians. Always
Absolutely.
worth going back and, like you say, sort of follow documents wherever they might have landed. That's really interesting. I wonder if you could talk a bit more. You mentioned a couple of times there about the Comanches and about Ruiz's sort of relationship with them. And the book shows that he was this really important kind of multifaceted cultural broker, not just between Anglos and Tejanos, say, but also between groups like the Comanches and the Cherokee and things. So what, could you talk a bit more about that? What allowed Ruiz to be so versatile in this area, and where did he develop his kind of linguistic and cultural skills?
One of the persistent themes and the persistent concerns of the people living at that time was frontier security, right? They were the enemy at the gates, if you will. And so they took a deep interest in diplomacy and interactions with those peoples because they had to somehow find a coexistence. Another thing I think we try to challenge in the book and try to explain is that even the cultural, the racial hierarchy matrix is different in Spanish colonial Texas than later on when we had this mass influx of Americans that brought their version of social hierarchy with them. So in Ruiz's time, there were two main categorizations of Indians, and one was gente de razón, people of reason, and those were the native peoples that entered the missions, became Christians, assimilated into Hispanic society. And then they had a category called Indios Barbaros, or they would sometimes call them Indios Enemigos, or enemy Indians, or barbarian Indians. And these were peoples that resisted assimilation or missionization. And the Spanish crown, of course, I'm oversimplifying hundreds of years of policy, but generally speaking, sought to assimilate or bring gente de razón into Spanish society. And the Indios Barbaros, they often fought wars of extermination, whether it was the Chichimeca, further south, and then as they moved up here, the Comanches were one of those. They strongly resisted any kind of, had no interest in becoming Spanish or European or Christianization as a general rule. And so there was persistent conflict. Ruiz grew up in that environment. One of his earliest connections with indigenous people was the practice of bringing in orphaned, or some would argue abducted children into the Spanish villa after a campaign against a native group as a way of Christianizing them and raising them. So Ruiz's father participated in that. There's several records where his father would baptize usually Lipan Apache children, and they were raised in the household with him, and so they're playmates, they're people in the household. You can pick up on some linguistic skills there. There was a common sign language on the plains, and so Ruiz became familiar with that as well, which allowed you to speak to people of different linguistic backgrounds. And so he grew up in this multi-ethnic society with the Comanche and the Apache being the persistent physical threat to day-to-day life. He begins his career on a pathway to become city attorney, serving on the town council. His in-laws are on the town council. Frontier security is one of their highest concerns, so he's dealing with those issues. And so how well his skills were honed leading up to his exile, it's hard to tell. Again, he's familiar because of that context. He's raised with indigenous peoples around him. They come into town to trade. But frankly, as he goes into exile following the Battle of Medina, he has a price on his head. He can't be in Texas. He can't be in Louisiana. He goes to the neutral strip, which is this area of mutual agreement. So there's no government. The United States agrees not to be there. Spain agrees not to be there. And he finds common cause with the Comanche in fighting a proxy war against the Spanish. In other words, continuing Hidalgo's revolution. They lose at Medina, but they continue. He's smuggling arms. and he befriends one particular group of Comanche. Of course, the Comanche are very decentralized in their organization. They don't have a specific leader or chief or or monarchy or anything of that nature. They tend to follow charismatic individuals, and often for ever shifting landscape. But there's a group called the Tenowa, and Ruiz coins that term, and it's his brief coalition that exists there on the Red River. He trades with them, he leads them into battle, he's a scout for them, and he lives among them for 7 to 8 years. And again, goes on the warpath against the Osage, goes as far as the Arapaho up in southern Colorado. And so, spending that much time, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight to know that eventually he returns and continues his career. But at the time, there's no, history, the future is indefinite. So he essentially becomes a Comanche, lives among them, and that gives him this unique insight into the culture. Again, he perfects this Indian sign language as well. We know from records he somewhere picked up the knowledge of Cherokee. He speaks Cherokee as well. When he writes his report on the Indian tribes of Texas in 1823, it has a degree of insight that none of his contemporaries have ever had. Most of his contemporaries write within this gente de razón and indios barbaros context. So they would have written about the Comanche as being barbarian. They write about how foreign and odd their religion is, how hostile they are, that type of attitude. Ruiz writes, describing things like their eschatology, their views of their afterlife, their moral system, their warrior fraternities, and that level of insight comes from living among them, from knowing the language, kind of truly understanding their motivation or their cultural perspective, which he was trying to give to the Spanish when he wrote his report in an attempt to at diplomacy. And I think one of the things that you learn very quickly when you start studying Native American history is it's full of cultural misunderstanding on both sides. Both sides are talking over each other, around each other. They're misinterpreting the events that are going on. They're speaking. The translations are so foreign. Trying to explain European legal concepts, Native American ideas of all of that it's full of misunderstanding that leads to all types of folly and error that is generally tragic. And Ruiz is able to transcend that for a brief period of time because of that time that he spent among them with really no hope or possibility in any foreseeable of returning to European society. So I think that's one of the things that makes him a very interesting figure and unique in Texas history.
Yeah, I wonder if I could follow up on that a little bit with a very kind of GLO-centric question. So the GLO Spanish collection has this really interesting set of documents having to do with attempts by the so-called immigrant tribes. And here in our documents, these are Cherokee, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Alabama Coushatta. And the documents deal with their attempts to obtain land grants in Mexico and Mexican Texas in exactly the time, the era of U.S. Indian removal. And one thing that's really clear from these documents, which I've been working with kind of recently, is that even though you can tell that opinions are somewhat divided among Mexican officials, but there's a certain core group of Mexican officials who really are really interested in incorporating these folks into the Mexican nation. They want them to become Mexican citizens and things like that. And ultimately, that project fails for several reasons. But since Ruiz played such an important role, especially in the early development of this kind of policy, this diplomacy, I wondered if you could talk about how he saw the failure of this kind of project, especially after the Texas Revolution. I know he didn't live that much longer after, but he must have seen the end of this kind of program coming and the Cherokees being driven out of Texas.
Earlier in his career, when he is commander at Nacogdoches, he sponsors an application for a land grant by the Cherokee and other immigrant Indians. This Spanish cultural context would have viewed them as gente de razón. They were civilized people. They had European agricultural systems, and they had been westernized to a large degree. And the predominant public policy interest was frontier security, which required immigrants, is what they viewed, right? And so, Ruiz has a quote that he supports immigration from anywhere, including hell itself, is one of the things he says. They just want people, right? They need people, and they need people to grow the economy, for Texas to have enough population to get independent statehood, separate from Coahuila. They needed them for frontier defense against the Indios Barbaros, the Comanche and the Apache, and for various reasons. So he's a big champion of indigenous immigration, along with European immigration and American immigration. So he's a very pro-immigrant person. He even kind of drags his feet. He does the whole the old Spanish, I obey, but I don't follow, kind of double speak in enforcing the law of 1830 that prohibited American immigration. So he was very consistent on that matter. When he served in the Texas Senate, he was naturally appointed to the Committee on Indian Affairs, and he was him, and then later on his family were followers of Sam Houston. Houston's policy of kind of reconciling with the native groups and finding a place for them in Texas. So yeah, I think he would have been very disappointed had he lived to see some of the removal of the quote unquote civilized or the immigrant Indian tribes, and again, having lived among them, and I think he saw them more as equals than other people had the advantage of doing. And it's one of the challenges, with this great influx of Southern Americans from the U.S. South. They had fought a whole generation of wars against the indigenous peoples in the Southeast, and they brought those prejudices and that experience and those hostilities with them. And so the political racial context of Texas radically changed within his lifetime, from the Spanish context to which is essentially the American one. And there was no place for, friendly or good Indians within that context, unfortunately. We see that as well with, for example, the Mission Indians in San Antonio. Again, classic textbook Gente de Razón, and following the Texas independence, they undergo what they term as cultural camouflage, where they outwardly present themselves as Mexican, because Indians had zero political rights. Mexicans may have had diminished rights, or within this racial context of the new Anglo-Texans, but they had some, and so they are able to do that, and they present themselves openly as Mexican only, not as indigenous. So there was a radical shift in perceptions on a public policy level and a societal, mainly due to that American immigration into Texas.
I want to change gears a little bit here. So yours is one of 3 presentations that I'm hosting, all on Spanish and Mexican topics. And I'm asking all 3 of y'all to answer a question about Mexican independence. Today, this year marks the 200th anniversary of Mexican independence from Spain. So how do you think your book should really change how we think about Texas's role in that struggle?
The first phase of Mexican independence, Miguel Hidalgo, right? He does his famous Grito de Dolores. The populace rises up. They're resisting, the French taking over the Spanish monarchy, and they're trying to restore the Spanish monarchy and looking for American rights, if you will, or within that system. And Hidalgo gets captured. He's executed in Chihuahua, and everybody knows that story. And then typically the traditional narrative is then things die down until a few years later, and then there's several waves of uprising until independence is achieved. But a lot of people don't follow the story northward, which is, Hidalgo is executed, but before he does that, he sends emissaries up through Texas to the United States, the Gutierrez Celada brothers. They meet with the US president. They request American intervention, which is denied because the Americans are about to go to war with Great Britain in the War of 1812. But they're given permission to raise an army and to use Louisiana as a base of operations. And so we have this Gutierrez McGee expedition, which a lot of us are familiar with in Texas history, but it's often presented as a filibustering expedition. And certainly the American elements on the expedition were interested in filibuster, But the Tejano, or the Mexican elements in the expedition, viewed themselves as a continuation of Hidalgo's uprising, very much so. That was their legitimacy among the population as they move forward, and that's the support they gained. And when you read about Francisco Ruiz, you see this. Ruiz has every reason to defend the Spanish colonial system, and it's through this illicit correspondence, through these polemics that San Antonio, from his printing press, that Ruiz has this political conversion, and he, by all of his contemporaries, the staunchest liberal in Texas, and so when the men take the field at the Battle of Medina and all the events leading up to that, they're doing that in this continuation of Mexican independence, and it continues. Ruiz goes into exile. He fights a 7-year proxy war, and all that is a continuation of Hidalgo's revolution and or uprising. And when independence is at hand, in 1821, the same military officer, Joaquin de Arredondo, that defeats Ruiz and the Tejanos at Medina, offers a pardon in exchange for him negotiating peace with the Comanche and the Apache. And so, there's this very real struggle in Texas. The largest battle in Texas history is the Battle of Medina. The state is decimated in the aftermath, and all that is a theater of the war for Mexican independence that's often forgotten. Certainly, in Mexico, they tend to not want to talk about Texas's role, and even here, it's often kind of skipped over or assumed that very little happened because the province was depopulated, and it was to a large degree, but because it's a theater of war for Mexican. The first Declaration of Independence in Latin America was issued in San Antonio. So that's what I kind of would like to bring Texas back into that context of being a theater within the role for Mexican independence. And hope was kept alive. It was it was a long shot, but that's how revolutions and struggles often get into those dark phases, and they occurred. I think that it's great to revisit the history from that perspective, and to see how people were acting within that framework, and that was their objective. And ultimately, it led to a different thing. It led to Texas independence, in part because the people sacrificed so much for Mexican independence, republicanism, and these ideals of Mexican liberalism, that when the Republic of Mexico did not live up to those, then they sought, the ideals transcended the national project, and that some of those aspirations were transferred into the Republic of Texas, especially among the Tejanos in San Antonio.
Thanks for that, Art. My next interview is actually Brad Folsom, who wrote the book on Arredondo. So I'm really excited to sort of put his work and your work into the conversation. I want to close out by asking you, what's the most important thing you want readers to take away from the book?
There is a deep and rich history of Texas that crosses over and transcends traditional narratives. And so, Jose Francisco Ruiz is one of these characters that, when you follow his life, it is the intersection of so many different narratives and peoples that I think that's what makes it stand out so much. I mean, we look at our lives, and history is unfolding before us, but it amazes me to reflect back and see the world events that come crashing to this frontier province. I mean, Texas might be analogous to something like northern Alaska to us today. It's the far end, remotest frontier, and yet things like the Napoleonic Wars and American Western expansion, and all of these things come colliding, thundering, and they end up here in this frontier community. And you have men like Jose Francisco Ruiz having to deal with those consequences, and they navigate these historical events. And as a biographer, you have to resist the temptation to over glorify or overly demonize your your subject and try to place them in context. These are real people dealing with real events, and in many respects, they act heroically. That's why we're writing about them, because they rise to the occasion. In other respects, they fail. They're real people, but overall, that's what makes it miraculous. I think is to see people who witness that transition from frontier community to a new Republic of Texas, and was able to navigate all these different colliding together here in Texas, whether it's all the different indigenous cultures that he had to work with, all these American and European immigrants coming in and finding your place within that context, and leading his constituency through that and risking everything. I mean, he certainly risked it all and lost it all, at Medina, paid the ultimate price, and then risked it again in 1836, with full knowledge of what that could mean for himself and his family. I think that's kind of, one of those things that really, the old century narrative of Ruiz, again, coming in as a Mexican liberal to sign the Declaration and exit the narrative, doesn't give it justice. When he was signing that document, he fully well knew what that meant. He knew the tyranny of armies, that could come back and what it could do. He knew what it meant to lose all of your property and be a stateless person. And I think that makes it even more heroic than perhaps somebody who's just caught up in the moment and argument without fully understanding its impact. So anyway, I think that's what makes people like Ruiz and Navarro, and maybe some of the other signers as well, who went through something similar, I think even more heroic than we typically give them credit for, because they have this entire backstory of having done it before and failed, and having paid those consequences, willing to do it again for the same ideals and the same aspirations.
Well, thank you so much, Art. This has been really great. We've been talking to Art Martinez De Vara. Again, his new book is called Tejano Patriot, The Revolutionary Life of Jose Francisco Ruiz. It's out now. We're very excited to have it here at the GLO in our research room as a research, as a reference for us. And again, thank you so much for joining us, Art.
Thank you for having me.